Welcome to the War Watch podcast, a 6-episode series from the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, a joint centre of the University of Geneva and the Geneva Graduate Institute.
Hello and welcome to the first episode of the War Watch podcast. Over 6 episodes, we examine conflicts that demand our attention, bringing you expert documentation, legal analysis, and concrete actions you can take. War Watch is an interactive online portal launching soon, based on our Agile and Focus project, where you can explore conflicts and track international humanitarian law violations in those conflicts. I'm Juliette Graf, and joining me throughout this series is Stuart Casey-Maslen, our special advisor to the Agile and Focus project. Stuart will help unpack the law and its limits in every episode, alongside guests who bring perspectives from the field. Today, for episode 1, we focus on Sudan, where more than 30 million people face what the United Nations calls the world's largest humanitarian crisis. Our guest today is Mona Rishmawi, member of the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Sudan, who documented atrocities in Darfur back in 2005, and is now back documenting many of the same crimes 20 years later. This is War Watch. Let's begin. Mona, for listeners who are not familiar with the conflict in Sudan, could you give us the essential history? How did we get from 2005 to today?
Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be on the first episode of this important series. Sudan has been in conflict for many, many years, for decades. The previous conflicts were very localized in certain regions. Right now, the current conflict, it's spread throughout the country. It covers almost 14 out of the 18 Sudanese states. When I was working on Sudan in 2005, it was on Darfur. Darfur today is one of the main theaters of the war. But actually, it's beyond that. The war has spread to Khartoum. It started in the capital, then it moved to Darfur, and then it moved to other areas. Right now, our concern is in places like Kordofan, on Al Jazeera, in most of the inhabited areas in Sudan. How it started, that's really important. In 2019, there were big protests. It started for economic reasons. They wanted economic reforms. It led to the President Bashir being ousted, quote and unquote, basically left. There was a military government, a bit of through negotiations with the civilians, they ended up with a civilian military coalition. And with the current head of the armed forces in Sudan, General Burhan became the head of that governing council, and his deputy was the current head of the RSF, which is now the main force challenging the armed forces in the country. This continued for a while, and then they had a civilian prime minister. In 2021, there was a problem between the civilian and the military. They ended up, both of them, Burhan and Hamiti together. They ousted the civilian prime minister. And in 2023, there were some talks. They did not agree to how to integrate the forces under Mr. Hamiti with the armed forces. So basically, the security forces inside Sudan that both actually attacked civilians, both harmed the protesters and so on. And there was a commission of inquiry about what happened there that the current government actually stopped. So in the mid-April 2023, the situation imploded and each side blames each other who started the war. But all of a sudden, there is a conflict inside Khartoum. Khartoum falls in the hands of the RSF. Army retreats to Port Sudan, and the whole situation implodes rather than explodes. And the RSF moved to Darfur and from there to other parts of Sudan. Now, you are talking about a very, very brutal war. Our fact-finding mission called it in the last report a war of atrocities. And that's important to highlight.
We're going to go into more detail on that just later. But firstly, I just wanted to clarify that we're looking at a conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces. Stuart, this is classified as a non-international armed conflict. Very quickly, what legal framework applies here? What rules are both parties supposed to be following?
There are specific rules that apply to what we call non-international armed conflicts. But in fact, the fundamental rules do not change. The duty to only target military personnel and military objectives, never to target civilians. That is exactly the same, whatever the conflict. The duty to make sure that you are minimizing, if not avoiding, the harm to civilians, death, injury, damage to civilian homes and other civilian objects. That is exactly the same. And then one that sadly has become a feature of the conflict in Sudan, the prohibition of starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. That also applies whatever the conflict may be. Perhaps the biggest difference between an international armed conflict and a non-international armed conflict in terms of the law actually relates to prisoners, that you don't have that status of prisoners of war in non-international armed conflict. But the fighting that is causing so much damage, so much harm, those rules are clear. They are beguilingly simple to respect. But as Mona said, sadly, they are being flouted on a systematic basis.
And as we record this episode, we are the 15th of October, 2025. Just over a month ago, the fact-finding mission, which you are one of the 3 members of, Mona, just released its report. Could you give us the scale of what you have been documenting?
As I say, we chose to call it a war of atrocities because as we were documenting and as we were analyzing what we are seeing, we found out what is that we are documenting patterns of violations that most of them amount to international crimes. I'll start with the RSF because in many ways, they are the ones who are in direct contact with the civilian population in many, many areas. There you are talking about destruction of property, about first murder and killings and violence against life. You are talking about looting and pillage. You are talking about sexual violence of an incredible brutality and incredible quantity that I never experienced. I never saw anything like this in my life, including when I did the 2005 Darfur conflict. You are talking about sieging. This morning there was a very good report on the siege of Al-Fasher. But it's not only Al-Fasher. It's Al Ubaid, it's in Kordofan, in other areas, encircling places without and not allowing food and water and medical equipment. So you are talking about violence against individuals and life, but also you are talking about the destruction of infrastructure that is indispensable for the survival of the civilian population. We found war crimes, but also crimes against humanity. We found that certain communities and certain ethnic groups have been targeted just for being who they are, for being a certain ethnic group. We also found there are discrimination and persecution on the basis of gender. And also, we found that if you destroy food production systems, you destroy if you destroy hospitals, and then you don't allow humanitarian assistance, what are you doing? You are killing the civilian population. So it's extermination. So you could say, well, we didn't really intend to exterminate a population, but you should have known as a policy, as a part of your policies, that this will lead to the death of a lot of people, which we are seeing now. In the case of the army, what we saw is a lot of there's airstrikes that are in areas that I would say using indiscriminate weapons, basically falling in place. Maybe they didn't want to target the civilians, but as a result, the civilians are targeted. So markets have been hit, marketplaces, we've seen hospitals also. Also, and I want to emphasize this, although it's also in the side of the RSF, torture in prison. That's really important. This is people are detained in really very difficult situations. And then maybe the last thing that I really want to emphasize for the army in particular is retaliation against certain communities and certain individuals that are seen as supporting or sympathizing with the RSF. But also in the case of one area in Al Jazeera, and I'd like to mention them in particular, the Kenabi community in Al Jazeera. This is a farmers' community in Al Jazeera. They've been particularly targeted by the allied forces to the army, Al-Barra brigades, and, we saw summary executions, we saw burned villages, we saw really attacks that are amounting to war crimes and amounting to really serious atrocities. So the conclusion, both sides and their allies, I want to stress the allies, the militias that are working on both sides, are committing atrocities. Perhaps they are not the same scale, but this is not how we judge. Each party is committing acts that qualify war crimes and crimes against humanity in the case of the RSF and qualify as war crimes in the case of the army.
Mona, as you investigate all these atrocities, you're facing a significant obstacle, is that you can't actually access Sudan. The government has denied the fact-finding mission entry. So how have you been investigating war crimes when you can't access the crime scene?
These days, it's not so difficult. I want to stress the fact that you deny an investigative body to enter your country, you are not shielding yourself. The truth will come out. There are people who are telling us, the refugees who are telling us their first-hand experience, but then there are modern technologies. I always say, Sudan and the Sudanese armed forces, allow us in and we hear you, but don't allow us in. We will continue to investigate. That will not protect you.
So your findings really document such a plethora of attacks, both against civilians and civilian infrastructure. But for this episode, I wanted to ground the discussion into specific examples that could really illustrate what's happening on the ground. Both your fact-finding mission report and our new spot report from the Geneva Academy document extensive attacks on water infrastructure. Mona, could we start with what you have been documenting in terms of water being used as a weapon in this particular conflict?
So people are denied water as part of the denial of food. If you talk about Darfur, Darfur in particular is desertified area because this is of climate change. You have less and less, agricultural areas, less and less access to fresh water. So people in Darfur need water. Where do they get their water? Either they get it from the dams that are very close to the region, or they get it from the wells. Now, what we have been documenting is both the destruction of the wells and attacks on dams. This means that this infrastructure, which is essential to prevent starvation, because water is part of food according to international law, and really it's important that is granted to the civilian population, because otherwise the people will starve and die. What we've seen is direct attacks on the water infrastructure, wells and so on. The other thing that is really important is basically as a result of the situation that now Sudan is engulfed in these conflicts for a long time, there is very little infrastructure. I want to mention in particular this village is called Tersin. This is in the Marra Mountains. There was a lot of rainfall, flooding in the area. The entire village disappeared because of the water flooding. About 1,000 people were killed. There is only one survivor in the entire village. Why am I mentioning this? One can say this is a natural disaster. Yes, it is a natural disaster. But nobody could reach that village because of the conflict. It's in the area that is considered, Jabal Marra is considered to be in a neutral area. The army wanted to send some support, but they couldn't really reach the support. The UN couldn't reach the area. Nobody could reach this area. So there was inability to provide humanitarian assistance to this area because of the war, and the result is this. So yes, in addition to everything, flooding and rainfalls and the rainy season and all this stuff also creates problems that the war prevents from being able to actually resolve because of the situation we are in.
And I'm thinking about specific examples that we've heard being talked about quite a lot. For example, the Golo Reservoir or what happened in Zamzam camp. Yeah. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Thank you for asking this, because that's more or less what I was trying to say about Darfur. So Zamzam is in Darfur. It's very close to Al-Fashir. It has been attacked multiple times, both Zamzam and the Abu Shuk camp. And the people in Zamzam and in these areas, and Al-Fashir in general, they rely on the Godo Dam for water supplies. So first, they are encircled. They cannot access the water. But then, even if they can access the limited times that they could access, the dam itself is being attacked, and therefore, you find multiple ways of multiple violations that led to these people, to the people in Zamzam, Darfur, Zamzam, Al-Fashir, and Abu Shok, particularly suffering from starvation, including water deprivation.
Stuart, let's go back to the law. When does cutting off water cross the line into a war crime?
So firstly, you can only target water or water infrastructure when it is being used for a military purpose. If it's being used for the civilian population, it can never be targeted, and targeting it deliberately would be a war crime. But I think it's important to add to what Mona said, that it is not just about the direct effects. Of course, if you target a dam, the forces they contain, that can cause flooding and can cause both death and also destruction of villages. And sadly, we've seen that in Sudan on several occasions. That is why dams are given special protection under international humanitarian law. Again, whether it be an international or, in this case, a non-international armed conflict. But we also need to think about the reverberating effects of those attacks. In Sudan, up to 70% of electricity comes from hydroelectric sources. That means it's not just the damage, the death, the destruction that results directly from the targeting of dams, it's also the knock-on effects. The destruction of water pumping stations, as Mona mentioned earlier, that leads to cholera. But then added to that, you have the impacts, the blockages to the delivery of humanitarian assistance. The delivery of vaccines has been disrupted, meaning that the risk of cholera is even greater. We saw the dam at Al-Bat, north of Port Sudan, burst. This wasn't from an attack. This was because the dam had not been maintained, because they could not get access to the dam in order to do it. And finally, it's important to remember that these impacts on food and water have very serious direct consequences for women and girls. If they have to go further distances to collect food, to get water, they are increasing the risk of suffering from sexual violence. And that, as Mona mentioned, is an epidemic across Sudan today.
And just going back to those reverberating effects that you were mentioning, do these cascade effects factor into legal calculations?
They should do. One of the problems that we have is that the rule of proportionality in attack, that's a rule that applies to all armed conflicts. It's not entirely clear how long and how much is foreseeable at the time of an attack. But they certainly should be. And the kind of things that we've talked about, these are utterly foreseeable. You know if you destroy pumping stations, you know if you destroy dams, you know what the consequences will be. Even if international humanitarian law may allow you to attack a military objective, you still have to think about whether the harm to civilians is going to be excessive. And in very many cases, the answer is a clear yes.
So targeting water is clearly one devastating pattern that we are seeing in the Sudan conflict, but it's definitely not happening in isolation. Mona, what's another major pattern from your reports that you think listeners need to understand today?
There are quite a few. I mentioned already the destruction of infrastructure like hospitals, like food supply systems, and so on. But I want to emphasize something that really I find absolutely shocking, which is the amount of sexual and gender-based violence that is happening right now in Sudan. The question is, there is no deterrence for sexual violence. The result is that we have documented rape, gang rape, forced nudity, abduction, sexual slavery, and forced marriage in these. And the complaints, these cases are mostly by the RSF. They often loot houses, destroy property, and rape women. And there are also cases of raping men and boys. These cases are often accompanied with incredible brutality. Many of these rapes result in pregnancies, unwanted pregnancies. So some of the girls and women are actually deserted by their communities because they became pregnant. And so it has a huge impact, not only on the lives of these women and girls and men and boys, but also on a community as a whole. So why do they do it? They do it exactly for that, to humiliate the individual and their communities. There's no safe place. Often these cases take place in front of the families, in front of husbands, in front of fathers, in front of children. And we had really documented cases of girls as young as 9 years old, in these rapes. So it's very, very, very serious, and it's extremely important to talk about, I think. I also want to say that we have received information, credible information of sexualized violence, sexualized torture, also by the armed forces. There are important cases that you can see in the report. I don't want to actually describe today because they are just way too gruesome. But I would say all these cases need to be investigated. We are yet to see an internal process by both the armed forces or by the RSF. Both of them deny that this is happening. We each blame each other for it. But we are yet to see anything credible to stop these practices. Today, only this morning, I received information about an incredible case of a 12-year-old girl that was just raped in one of these cases. And again, I don't want to tell the circumstances of it because it's just way too gruesome. It's really a situation that has grown out of proportion. It's a disgrace. It's against everything that Sudanese stand for. It's against their culture, it's against their religion, it's against the society, and it is leading to really destroying the social fabrics of Sudanese society. There has to be a strong will to stop this violence.
Stuart, let's quickly go back to you for the legal perspective. When does sexual violence on this scale amount to crimes against humanity rather than, and I say this in quotes, just war crimes? What's the legal distinction here?
So crimes against humanity are crimes that are committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population. And sadly, we've seen this this time. We also saw it back in the early 2000s. As some of the listeners will know, last week, so on the 6th of October, there was the first successful prosecution before the International Criminal Court of one of the people responsible for those crimes, for some of those crimes against humanity in Darfur. Ali Kushaib was convicted of a litany of crimes, both those that he ordered directly and those that he assisted, sometimes by the distribution of weapons. We're talking about multiple murders, multiple rapes, torture, persecution, and many of this was directed against members of the Fur ethnic group, in particular men. This is shocking that it has taken us 20 years to get this conviction. We must earnestly hope that this is the first and not the last. And as Mona said, we need a thorough investigation set up by the institutions themselves, the Sudanese Armed Forces, the RSF, because it is in their interest to make sure that these rules are respected.
And Mona, your report uses a very specific legal term, which caught my attention, extermination. Can you explain what extermination means legally and why the fact-finding mission concluded that the RSF acts may amount to extermination?
So extermination is about inflicting conditions of life on a certain ethnic, political, or a certain ethnic group, particularly with the deprivation of food or medicine, to basically bring about the extermination of the group, like to end the group, to kill the group. So it's another form of also what we call from time to time genocide. It's another form because it also adds the political angle, which we don't find in the Genocide Convention. If you deny food and water and medical supplies, and you deny humanitarian assistance, then actually what you are doing is that you are killing that particular population. And that's why we use the term extermination. It's the combination of these three factors. We didn't come to it lightly. I've been working on this conflict for quite some time. It was really shocking to me to see the brutality of it. And this is why we went for extermination. By the way, in Arabic, the word extermination and genocide are the same.
And so my question now is, what's being done about this? And I ask this because, Mona, you were part of documenting similar crimes in Darfur 20 years ago. These led to an ICC referral, arrest warrants, and yet here we are. What does it mean to you, the fact that we're having this conversation again today, 20 years later?
First, I think the most important thing is that this has to stop. We had so many calls for a ceasefire, but the ceasefire is not taking place. The ceasefire is not taking place because each party think that they can win militarily. What we saw in the last 2 years, this is impossible. Nobody will dominate this situation militarily. And frankly, the external powers who are supporting one party or another should not support this because it's really not for the interest of Sudan. And the situation in Sudan does not only affect Sudan, it also affects the entire region, in the entire Horn of Africa, and also across the Red Sea, across the Sahara and across the Red Sea. So really it's very, very important. And of course, to the north, to Egypt, and to the south, to Ethiopia, to South Sudan, it really affects the region as such. So this conflict has to stop. And it's beyond me why this conflict is even allowed to continue the way that it's continuing to this. The second thing we need proper peace process that deals with the root causes not only of this conflict but also all the other conflicts. We need not only to negotiate between the army, those who are armed, those armed and they are fighting, but also to bring in the civilian population, bring in the communities, bring in the youth, bring in the women, bring in the people who can really find a proper way. And the Sudanese are very capable. I have a lot of confidence in the Sudanese population. They just need the opportunity. And third, and that's, I think it's really obvious from all what we saw, we need accountability and proper justice. I said that the parties have to investigate their behavior. But until today, we haven't seen any credible investigation from either side. This is not happening. This is why we think the ICC must continue its work in Sudan, starting from Darfur, but the international community must extend its jurisdiction for the entire Sudan. But also, we know that these small rapists and these small actors, not every single individual will appear before the ICC. And the amount of perpetrators is huge. This is why we need a separate judicial mechanism that is independent and impartial, that works in complementarity with the ICC, which means what? It means it tries the same acts for the same crimes. You cannot just say my Sudanese law means this. The rape is defined in my Sudanese law that. No, you have to incorporate the Rome Statute and incorporate international crimes under international law and be able to impartially and independently investigate and prosecute in the crimes that are committed in Sudan in accordance with international standards. The Sudanese people cannot just continue living from one conflict to another. Interim reparations are absolutely needed. People need to survive. They need assistance. These women who are raped, they need medical assistance. The medical infrastructure inside Sudan is really destroyed, and in the refugee camps is very minimum. They need assistance. They need support. And this has to be given immediately. And lastly, I think it's really important that whoever is mediating and negotiating this conflict works to bringing the communities together, works for national dialogues, works for civilian democratic rule that really ends these conflicts and puts Sudan on the right trajectory and the right. I have a lot of confidence in the Sudanese people. The capacity of the Sudanese people is amazing. It's just they don't have a proper governing structures. Put a good governing structure in place and you will see this country excelling beyond our imagination.
Stuart, there are credible allegations that the United Arab Emirates has been supplying weapons to the Rapid Support Forces. The United States has even sanctioned Rapid Support Forces linked companies in the UAE. How does state responsibility work when a country is potentially arming forces who are committing these atrocities?
Well, that's what we have a UN Security Council for. They are supposed to maintain international peace and security, and they have abdicated from their responsibilities in Sudan, as they have in a number of other conflicts. I think it's very important, as Mona mentioned, that we look at the responsibility of third states, because the overwhelming majority of weapons that are being fired in Sudan today were not produced in Sudan. They came from outside. The Sudanese armed forces, the RSF, they're not producing their own weapons, and especially not their own ammunition. That means they are being supplied this from outside, either by third states or by the acquiescence of third states. And if you want to stop the conflict, you stop the fuel being poured on the conflict. And that comes down to ammunition.
So I'd like to end each episode of this podcast series with a forward-looking question to our guest. Mona, where do you find hope? Or is hope the wrong word?
No, I have a lot of hope. I think it's in the Sudanese people. I think the Sudanese people are very capable of moving things forward. Of course, right now the warring parties are preventing this. They are preventing the country from moving forward. Sudanese are doctors, lawyers. They actually help countries throughout the region and beyond to stand on its own feet. And of course they are capable of having their own country standing on its own feet. It's just they need the right structures and the right opportunities, and they need these weapons to be laid down.
This has been the first episode of the War Watch podcast, a 6-episode series released on a monthly basis, exploring armed conflicts and the laws that seek to limit their impact. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss the next one. All the reports, resources, and actions we mentioned today are in the show notes, and you can explore more at thegenevaacademy.ch. I'm Juliette Graf. With me today was Stuart Casey-Maslen, Special Advisor to the IHL in Focus project, and our guest was Mona Rishmawi. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to War Watch, a podcast from the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, a joint centre of the University of Geneva and the Geneva Graduate Institute. Find us at geneva-academy.ch and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.